Welcome to the Shit Shower and Self Care Podcast, a place for men to talk about the stuff that matters. For now, grab yourself a drink and let's crack on. Hi, and welcome to the Shit Shower and Self Care Podcast. This is episode number 2. Tonight, I'm very delighted to be able to introduce Jack Blakey onto the show. Now, Jack has put his hand up and volunteered to come onto the show as a gay man, as someone who is a massive football fan, as we'll definitely get into, as a man who has experienced and experiences depression, and as a massive movie fan. Now, I'm sure that Jack is far more than any one of those descriptions could ever be. And hopefully we'll find out a little bit more about that and about Jack's experience more broadly. However, I'm aware that I'm introducing Jack, but Jack knows himself far better than I ever could. So, can I just hand over to you, Jack, a little bit and say hello, introduce yourself,
Sure
or
thing.
anything you want to?
Hey, I'm Jack Blakey. As you say, movie fan, football fan, gay man, very big parts of my personality, my identity. So not unfair to describe me that way at all. I am a huge film fan. It's probably my biggest hobby. It's what I want to do as a career, working within the cinema industry. So big interest. And then I've always been a football fan and a pretty solid Blade since moving initially to Bramall Lane itself when I first came to Sheffield.
I'm going to try and show absolutely no bias at all, being a massive United fan myself. So I'll just hold that in mind, listeners, that might happen a little bit during this conversation. The first thing that I'm going to ask, Jack, is something that I'm going to try and make a bit of a regular feature, because these conversations, they can sound a little bit formal and a little bit stilted sometimes, and I don't want that to be the case. I want this to be a little bit less formal, a little bit just like a chat.
Okay.
So I want to imagine that we are sat in a pub or a bar, anything like that. Maybe a bar before a film, for instance. As soon as that's, I'm sure, a place that you can relate to.
Yep, definitely.
Now, let's imagine that that's where we are. What drink have you got in your hand?
So usually for either a match day or before a film, I'm having a pint, maybe an IPA, or quite a fan of Birra Moretti, if I'm allowed to name brands.
No, yeah, is this the point where I have to sort of wave around for endorsements? I'll pretend not.
Yeah, other lagers are available, of course.
Yeah, the
Um,
BBC disclaimer.
yeah, so usually I'll go for a pint, lager, IPA, that sort of thing. If I'm wanting something to nurse, then I'll definitely take a pint of Guinness. But if it's getting into the evening portion of things, then I'll start on vodka and Coke, vodka and any kind of fizzy mixer.
I like how that had changed completely depending on where we are. So
Yeah,
I said last time, it's no surprise probably to anyone that knows me, but I'd probably be joining you on a pint or IPA. So just imagine, listeners, that this is either in a bar before a film or potentially before a match day. Although if you can hear each other in a pub before match day, then good luck to you. But either one, let your imagination run. So, what convinced you to come onto this pod?
Um, I think the description of the podcast that you gave me really did interest me in general, just as something that I think talking about like mental health and the way that it sort of integrates into our everyday life in things like our hobbies. Um, you don't really get a chance to talk about that very often. And as someone who is um, a gay man living with depression, all those descriptors, Having those things all interact with each other is a very day-to-day experience for me that you never really get to talk about. So it was nice to just have the opportunity to come on, maybe discuss it a bit, be part of opening that conversation up. I find that idea quite exciting.
And when you're so in your day to day life, do you get do you get the opportunity to be able to talk about how those elements of life sort of interact, come together?
Um, Certainly more recently, in more recent years, being a part of Rainbow Blades has obviously been a very good opportunity for my sexuality and my interest in football to intersect a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
Becoming more active with, excuse me, becoming more active with like union work at work has allowed me to experience more. How do I phrase this? Sort of self care and things like that, just in the workplace. So I've been able to experience the intersection of mental health and work. So I've not always had the opportunity to talk about it, but definitely more so in the last sort of couple of years. And it's an increasing thing that's happening for me, which I think is good.
Yeah, because it's interesting to hear. It's almost like sometimes those parts of life can seem little silos. So there's a bit over here, a bit over there, a bit over there. When actually they do all intersect, they do all come together.
Yeah, exactly. And it's for example, when you were introducing me and using those descriptors and saying like, oh, I'm not just those things, but the fact is that those descriptors are huge parts of the person that I am, and they all intersect with one another, and taking one in its like isolation is probably a bit reductive, but all of them together are exactly who and what I am. So
Mm. And sometimes we talk about wearing different hats, but actually it's not wearing different hats. 'Cause it's not like you automatically take one off to put another one on, is it?
no,
It's
exactly.
so you mentioned during that answer, you mentioned Rainbow Blades,
Uh-huh.
and they're an organisation I've come across quite a lot recently, which is fabulous. And they, for people who don't know what they do, what Rainbow Blades are about, could I ask you to give a bit of a description, a bit of background for people listening?
Yeah, of course. So in its most basic form, Rainbow Blades is an organization that exists to A, empower and champion LGBT voices within football, and B, bridge the gap between LGBT people and allies. That's the basic sort of foundation of all of the work that Rainbow Blades does. So this can take the form of just having sort of pre-match socials or post-match socials on an early kickoff because no one wants to be out of bed and at the pub at 9 a.m. Well, some people do, but
Well, yep.
so pre-match socials just as like a social space. We have virtual socials where different LGBT blades and allies across the country, even internationally in some cases, can still have the social aspect of football and meet other LGBT or ally people. There's also quite a lot of work that goes on at committee level, sort of with the club, with the Sheffield United Community Foundation, lots of different organisations sort of complementing each other with the basic intention of advancing and bettering situation for LGBT people within the football world.
You've used a phrase in that a couple of times, and I just want to ask a bit explicitly, really, in terms of allyship
Mm-hmm.
and what an ally is. Could I just ask for a little bit, a bit of clarity? What does that mean on a practical level, on a day to day level?
So I think, like most things, you'd probably get a different answer, slightly different answer from everyone that you ask. But for me, an ally is anything from a person who is cisgender, heterosexual, but completely involved in like community grassroots foundations, doing daily work to try and better the situation, all the way over to people who are just not homophobic and not transphobic, and generally just don't make LGBT people's lives worse and see us as people, basically.
Hmm.
Which is such a silly thing to say, but it's also kind of true because obviously there is still that kind of, at best, prejudice and at worst, outright hatred. So, yeah, I think anyone who's well intentioned and just supports LGBT people is an ally, no matter how casual or I can't think of the word that I'm trying to think of, but like headlong right into the activism.
Hmm. So it's not necessarily, and please correct me if this is in any way misrepresenting what you're saying. That idea that it can be the most active ally, or it could be not necessarily passive ally, because that can come with its own problems, can't it? I suppose. But like you say, the intention is to be an ally as opposed to just sort of, yeah. I think there's something about intention in there as opposed to it just being sort of passive and
Yeah,
neutral states.
absolutely. I mean, and even to say, again, passive is not the greatest word, but it does sort of work as like the opposite of active. So I'll go with that for a moment, but obviously it is flawed. um,
Yes, definitely.
Even someone whose only interaction with the LGBT community might just be with one friend, like someone that they know have grown up with who's come out later and they've kind of been forced to deal with this, just making that one person's life a little bit more comfortable by being supportive and basically just showing what I would consider like common human decency. But that's a whole other thing. um, just helping and supporting that one person, I believe, makes you an ally. Obviously, at the other end of the spectrum, you could be one of the people that was taken to the streets of London in the 60s, aiming for decriminalization of gay
Mhm.
sex. Like anywhere on that spectrum, I believe is allyship.
Brilliant, thank you. And it's I suppose it's a word that you see on sort of social media gets thrown around quite a lot, and it's actually to have a, I suppose not a nailed down definition, but sometimes just to unpack what that word might mean to people who aren't part of a particular community, whether we're talking about allyship around homophobia, whether we're talking about allyship against racism, whatever that may be. To actually sort of unpack that word sometimes is really, really important. To some think sometimes if people don't know what a word means, they might stay away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ally is a label that, in my opinion, everyone should aspire to. I
Yeah.
think a lot of conversations around, in particular, trans rights, but certainly LGBT rights as well at the moment, things are getting slightly worse. And a lot of the time, people will say things like, oh, most people don't care, or no one cares about this. Everyone just wants you to do what you want, just don't shove it down our throats, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of the time, the people who do say those things do think they're being helpful, or at the very least, not being antagonistic.
Hmm.
And that's not necessarily the case because there is a difference between apathy and allyship, and it is all about intention.
And just with that, hearing you talk about sort of labels that are placed onto people in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, so whether it's allyship, whether it is LGBT. I know I mentioned earlier, sort of living with and having experienced depression.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just ask a little bit about sort of the impact of organisations like Rainbow Blades, for instance, or affiliate organisations at other football clubs, for instance? What does it mean to see those type of organisations?
Again, I can only really speak from my own experience rather than like appointing myself as a spokesperson for a community.
Of
But
course.
for me, as someone who is both like active within an organization such as Rainbow Blades, and also as someone who gets to see the benefits that they have achieved, I think that organizations like Rainbow Blades, like the different affiliated, not just LGBT fan groups, there's also disability fan groups, senior fan groups, all with their own sort of mission of championing the rights and basically just trying to make the experience of being a football fan more inclusive and more accessible for people who might not necessarily be the natural demographic. And that's the baseline of what all of the groups do. They exist primarily to help people enjoy football. Now, of course, there's lots of things like Rainbow Blades will work with the Rainbow Laces campaign.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a lot of overlap with the work that Sheffield United Community Foundation does. We have our charity, well, not our charity, but we work very closely with Say It, which is an LGBT charity in Sheffield. So there's all of these different organizations working in conjunction. Some of the things that we do are like fundraising for specific causes, but at its base level, the point is to make things better and to try and help people enjoy football.
I'm going to use a word that I think you used earlier, but it sounds very human.
Yeah, I mean, that is basically the point. Like, for all of the good that can be done in terms of like organizing and activism and things like that, what's the point in any of it if you don't really have the social aspect? Like, what's the point in any of it if you don't get to have the enjoyment of just having hobbies and things? So, yeah, like football is great and huge fan, especially when we're doing well. So, the last couple of weeks not been so fantastic, but
Yeah, we can move swiftly on.
yeah, let's just go straight past that one. But yeah, like being able to enjoy football in both a social and human, for want of a better word, environment with other people who are either LGBT themselves or in order to be a member of Rainbow Blades, you're probably going to be an ally unless you've been very confused. But so it's just a guarantee that there's that space.
I was going to ask what it feels like to have that space, but I'm just going to reword it slightly and ask, what's it like when you don't have that dedicated space?
Do you know, it's really strange because until I had that, I didn't miss it. But now that I have it, I couldn't imagine not. And it's funny. I don't know if I can actually describe it with words, but it's like before I was a member, before I started building friendships with people in this group, it felt like my sexuality was sort of on one part, my interest in football was on another part, and those didn't really overlap. Whereas now, because there's a space that those two things can safely coexist, it's like experiencing them both in a slightly different way, and that feels incredible because I've never been able to have any kind of space where those two aspects of my identity intersect in such a like blatant way. I I don't know if I'm being clear here, but I'm sure somewhere through my rambling there'll be a point. But
No, it almost sounds like they're sort of two sets of colours that are sort of coming together almost.
yeah,
They're being kept completely separate. You bring them together, they don't quite look the same anymore. They look weird.
exactly. Like I used to be a gay man and a football fan. Now I'm a gay football fan, and I don't really want to separate those two things again because even though like being a football fan doesn't affect my sexuality, being gay doesn't affect my interest in football. Getting to experience them both at the same time in a place that's safe to do that is just something that I don't ever want to lose now that I have it. And it's not something I ever thought about until I did have it. So it's difficult to answer and say what does it feel like to not have it because I
Mm.
don't ever really want to find out.
One of the things that led me to ask that is because I'm aware of my perspective as a straight man who's a football fan. That those two aspects of my personality are never really separate. They are intrinsically together a lot of the time, And I think back to even some of the chants. You know, a lot of football fan chants are very heterosexual, to say the very least.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
it's not something I'd ever considered, especially growing up now. Obviously, I'm a bit older. I'm more aware of the language I use and more aware of what's going on around me. Whereas I don't think I ever did growing up.
yeah, I've had this kind of conversation with people, straight people that I've never really had to like think about it in isolation. And why would you? Like, it just is not something that would naturally occur unless you have a reason to think about it. And I think it does lead back into the whole, oh, it's fine to be who you are, just don't shove it in our face sort of thing. When you have like, for example, two dads in a Christmas advert. And it's like, well, okay, why is that shoving it in your face? But the 40 mums and dads together is
Mm-hmm.
not a heterosexual statement. And I think it's because, like, being LGBT is inherently political, but being straight is not, because that's how people have made it. And when you do actually start to think about the way that, I hate using like the clinical sort of activisty terms, but like there is a lot of heteronormativity in a lot of parts of culture.
Mm-hmm.
Football is probably a very solid example of it. And when you actually start thinking about it, it's like, oh yeah, actually, like, I mean, how many chants are there that there's stuff about like shagging the opponent's women and things like that that are not just like a bit heteronormative, but also quite gross when you think about
Yeah.
it.
Well, as soon as you start to consider what that is, you go, oh God, no. The one that's popping into my head, which is probably the only safe, well, I say safe one that I can think of, is it ends full of tits, Fanny and United, or
Yeah.
Sheffield is wonderful. And you're going, hold on, actually, when we start to break that out, that applies to one subset, and basically a subset of straight men.
Yeah, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when
Hmm.
people who already have that kind of like banter then decide it's a problem for example, LGBT fans to have like carve their own space, then that's where it's like, well, actually, you've already got all this, so where's the issue?
It goes back to something. The erosion of me having all the space is, hold on, no, it's not an erosion at all. It's someone carving their own space is not an erosion of yours.
Exactly.
And I suppose one of the other things I wanted to ask in terms of your experience that you've mentioned within Rainbow Blades, within sort of seeing the type of work that they do. Have you noticed any shifts or any changes in terms of other people's responses, or whether they're part of Rainbow Blades or not?
Um, so I'll preface this by saying that I've been very lucky in the past at Bramall Lane, and I've never really experienced direct homophobia. I've heard a couple of things that I thought, really wish you hadn't said that out loud, but most of the experiences that I've had have been okay. So I don't really have like a worst case to compare it to. But I do think that people having conversations has definitely increased. There's been times that I've sort of looked sort of outside the concourse. I'll go for a vape at halftime, and I'll hear people talking about things that I'm as guilty of stereotyping as anyone else is. I'll see two guys in their 50s that wouldn't look out of place in a Firm movie, and they'll be
Mm-hmm.
talking just casually about like rainbow merch and not saying anything negative, which is a very low bar, but it's also something that I'm not necessarily sure would have happened even 5 years ago. You see people with the merchandise as well, which is fantastic because even though it seems like such a trivial thing, just seeing someone wearing something with a rainbow is like awesome. Because it's like you look at that person, you're like, either you're really passionate about the NHS in the last 2 years, or you're an ally. So,
Both.
yeah,
You're allowed to be
you are allowed
both.
to be.
It's
But
worth saying.
fully encourage everyone to do both.
And we're talking about sort of an organisation and organisations that are having an impact. We see there's been a lot of discourse in media recently around players and sort of coming out. As I know recently, I think Gary Lineker put something about there's a Premier League player who we know is going to be, who we know is coming out, and immediately that just led to a bit of a media circus of who is this person? Let's try and find him for. Let's try and. I just want to ask, what's it like to see those stories about sort of visibility in players?
So it's a really difficult topic because on the one hand, I do think that visibility is important, and people like Josh Cavallo, not 100%
Yeah,
sure how to pronounce his surname, Jake Daniels, Xander Murray, sort of the people who in the last year or so have come out. I think those are fantastic things that they've done that will make a lot of people's lives a little bit less uncomfortable. And I think it's fantastic. But those were all decisions that they made themselves, and that's how it should be. I am
yeah,
a firm believer that Gary Lineker probably thought he was doing a very good thing by saying that, and he wasn't. Um, the speculation, it can be so uncomfortable, and I remember being, can't remember how old I was. I think it was the News of the World, which probably dates it. But I remember there being like a front page that was like gay soccer stars, and it had like the silhouette and the question mark. And every single time you see those sorts of speculative stories, I just think, is it really not changed? Like, can you not just let people get on with it? And if they want to come out, make the space comfortable for them to be able to, if they choose to do so. But yeah, I think the stories that kind of encourage people to make themselves into a almost political martyr are almost as bad as if one of the newspapers of the country just started posting slurs and headlines and abusing people in the captions. Like, it's really not helpful. And I recognize that it's like slightly contradictory, being like, I love people who are visible and do their best to be role models, but also only if they want to. Please do not pressure people into doing that sort of thing.
yeah. It comes down to
Yeah,
choice, doesn't it?
absolutely.
It comes down to volition. But then I think that's something that we talk about with most things, isn't it? We want people to be able to feel free to choose should they wish to do
Yeah,
so.
absolutely. And like, I feel that sometimes these kind of conversations where it's like, oh, who's going to be the next one, really do take, it's almost taking advantage of like sensationalism.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll go with
sensationalizing some variation of that is taking advantage of that, shifting all the focus onto trying to make headlines and taking it away from the work that should be getting done, which is making anyone who chooses of their own volition to take that risk, that it's going to be as easy for them as possible. And I worry that when we do sit and speculate, as well as being just a general unpleasant thing to do, it takes much needed attention away from the hard work that needs to be done.
And I realise we're talking quite a bit about sort of sexuality, understandably, quite a lot about football, understandably. And I also know that when you introduced yourself to me, you mentioned you're someone who has experienced and does experience
Yep.
depression. And I'm just wondering about how conversations around depression and in terms of men being able to converse about their experience, their feelings freely. Just wanted your sort of input on that, really, and just sort of what's your experience of that?
So I think actually it's one of a few ways that being gay has actually been quite a benefit to my experience, because I do think that a lot of the difficulties that men face in talking about their mental health and even in some cases physical health, um, a lot of the issues that people have with that kind of come through pressures of the expectations to be a man, which, for rightly or wrongly, gay men do get to sidestep a little bit, which is not great in terms of, for example, fitting into a football crowd. But it's certainly helpful in sort of gaining the confidence to be able to talk openly about mental health. I'm quite happy to talk about my experience with depression because I've done it for a long time. I've made the active choice to try and have open conversations, to talk to people when I'm feeling low, to talk to people when I'm feeling good as well. I don't want to be someone who's just open about the negative feelings. I try to be open with my positive ones too. And I think that as a gay man, my experience of depression has been slightly different because those expectations of how I should deal with emotions and things are slightly different.
Can I ask how they feel different?
Um, I mean, without turning into like an A-level sociology essay, I do think it comes back to expectations of masculinity, in my opinion, and the kind of gender norms that I'm subjected to are not quite the same as what straight men are subjected to. And in my case, like there's much less of a pressure on sort of stoicness, whereas I do feel like straight men really do have a bit of pressure in that regard. So I think that's one big difference. I'm not expected to just put up with feeling bad.
And I realise I'm bringing this back to football a little bit, but it's that sense of when you're playing, and I've been many a times where I've taken a pretty big hit, and I remember, well, partially remember, getting knocked out and having quite bad concussion afterwards, to the point where my friend, who will know who he is, took me to A&E and told them my name and my address because I couldn't. And even though I'd felt like that, I'd carried on playing because there was a part of me that didn't want to stop. It's like, I can't. I've got to finish. I can't let this show.
Yeah.
And actually, that I couldn't show that I was quite upset by the fact that I couldn't remember who I was, my name or anything like that. But even at that level, I wasn't showing outwardly being scared or upset.
Yeah. And
I was
yeah, I
terrified.
mean, that's a very
It's
natural
worth pointing out.
reaction to a situation as scary as that.
Yeah, it is. Um, Funnily enough, I stopped playing fully not long after that.
I can understand that.
But again, it's going back to yeah, it's going back to this idea of what masculinity is, and I like to think I'm someone who talks about emotions quite a lot, given my job, and yet there's still part of that that's in there, and it still does dictate your behaviour whether you're aware of it or not. And
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely
it's
agree. Like, I think those pressures do still exist for LGBT people, but just in a slightly different way because they're not associated with expectations of masculinity. I think, like, do you see what I mean about the sort of slight difference there?
Yeah, of course. And I realised, we're both painting quite broad strokes here, aren't we? And there's massive individual variance
Yeah.
within that, of course. But yeah, just as general trends. I suppose one of the other questions that I have is just anything that you would like to add in general about the intersection and the power of the intersection between football, between sexuality, between mental health, and what do you think the next steps are within that?
I mean, you just said about this
Nice,
painting
nice,
broad strokes. I
nice,
don't
easy
think we can
question.
attack that question without painting some extremely broad strokes, but I'll give it a go. Um, I think in terms of sexuality and mental health, the intersection there is learning to be at peace with the reality of yourself and finding healthy ways to express that. Football, also finding healthy ways to express that, like not shouting slurs at the opposition, is probably a great place to start with that. Yeah, I think, again, extremely, extremely broad strokes. But I think the intersection between the three and kind of any kind of facets of people's identity or different hobbies and how they all interact with each other are just basically about just trying to be good. Like, if you try to be outwardly and inwardly kind, that's a great start. That's the best I can do.
I think that's pretty perfect. And the idea of kindness and the idea of compassion, of we're going into this high, we talk this whole podcast, talking about men being able to express their internal experiences in a fancy way, or their emotions, what's going on for them, if we want to just talk like normal people.
Exactly.
When we're talking about compassion, that can often sort of get a bit sickly and can feel sort of counter to what masculinity is sort of portrayed in certain circles, when actually to be allow yourself to be open to those experiences, allow yourself to be open to those thoughts, those feelings, not just of yourself but of other people, and to want to try and do something to help. Actually, that's a really big thing to be able to do, and it's quite a difficult thing to be able to do. And actually sort of raising that with kindness, like you just mentioned, I think is sort of probably where we might all want to aim for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of issues with the way that men and even young boys as well. I mean, like even in the playground, there's usually a different reaction to a little girl crying and a little boy crying. And it's like that's such an unhealthy thing to do to a kid. But like in the long term, stuff like that, all the way up to the attitudes that we have to ourselves, all interlink and make it more difficult. And if we can just kind of break that expectation of even the self expectation of being stoic, like being open doesn't mean being weak, being kind doesn't mean being a pushover. Like, I think there's a lot of work to do in that regard, but I think it started.
I love the kind doesn't mean
Yeah,
pushover.
I mean,
Reminds me of a phrase that I've heard about sort of relentlessly kind.
yeah, I think that kindness is the best trait that a person can have, but a lot of people stop with kindness expressed to other people. And for me, the turning point of my battles with my own mental health, the point where my depression became something that I lived with rather than something that I fought against, was the point where I sort of made the active choice to try and be kinder to myself. And so, yeah, I don't really know how to sort of roll that into one thought, but yeah, basically just try to do good, and that's a great start.
I think that's a pretty perfect note to end that little bit. Thank you very much, Jack. So, welcome back. Hopefully, that piece of music has just played and we've just transitioned seamlessly into the second part of this pod. So, as part of a regular feature, I'm going to ask every guest who comes on a little question, a little question about a character that's inspired them. Now, that can be from TV, it can be from film, it can be from books, it can be games, whatever. Basically, someone who inspired the guest's idea of what it meant to be a man or an inspiring man or male or whatever in their lives. And today's no exception. So, Jack, I'd just like to ask, can you tell me a character who has inspired you, who's inspired you as a man, if that's okay?
Absolutely. I'm sure you won't be surprised that the character that I'm going to choose is also a gay man. So I would say Alec Lightwood from the Mortal Instruments books by Cassandra Clare, and later on the Netflix show Shadowhunters as my character.
I will confess to the listeners that I do search up characters who are mentioned, because unfortunately I don't know every fictional character in existence, much to my annoyance. So can I ask Jack, why did you choose Alec? What was it about Alec Lightwood?
So I think a good way to preface this is by saying that I read the books when I was sort of a young teenager, And then the TV show came out as I was sort of 17, 18. And in those two different depictions, Alec's journey kind of reflected my own life a bit. In the books, it's very much about sort of coming to terms with sexuality and exploring sort of the person that you want to be. And
Mm-hmm.
in the show, it was more about, it was much of a less homophobic world, for want of a better way to say it. There were some of those pressures still there, but it was much more about like the exploration of the physical side of sexuality, interpersonal relationships, and sort of retaining masculinity and embracing femininity and all those different things. So I think that to start with, it was just a character that I experienced at the right time for me, which is why I sort of grew quite attached. Just seeing this sort of scared gay kid come into, well, spoiler alert, develop into this like natural leader who had an open relationship with a man, open in terms of like honest, not the other form.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. The other version of
yeah,
that word. Yep.
so having a very like open and public relationship with a man while still being a leader in a patriarchal society and being accepted as such in what is essentially a race of warriors.
What was it like to? See, it sounds like you identified quite strongly, especially when you first started to read about Alec and sort of follow his journey. What was it like to see someone that you recognised on the page?
Um, I think it wasn't necessarily a good or bad thing because unfortunately I also identified with a lot of his negative traits in being very sort of petty and jealous, which I hope I've grown out of now. But it was just, I think it was the first time that I ever looked at a fictional character and thought, like, this is very much someone who I know, like, this feels like someone that is real to me, which is the best way that I can phrase that. It's essentially that I saw my own personality reflected in what I was reading, in the journey, and that felt really cool. And it just felt nice to sort of see that those things that I was worried about and what I was insecure about sort of being worked through by this not real person who realistically had no bearing on my life. And it was kind of a way for me to just sort of think like, okay, this is going to be okay. I can do this. It was nice. It was like I felt supported in a way.
It sounds quite inspiring.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I was like 13 at the time, so probably working my brain in a different way to it works now, but yeah, it felt inspiring at the time, and looking back on it, I think it was kind of exactly what I needed to have that sort of inspiration.
And I wonder, because again, this comes back to the I can only ever talk from my perspective, as obviously we all can. And I do read a lot of fantasy, but I read a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fiction, and it is something that I have thought about and wondered about. That often I read characters and I identify with them without without ever thinking about sexuality, without ever thinking about that until it's explicitly written on the
Mm.
page. Because why? Well, because I'm seeing it from my perspective. I ever wondered, does that ever come across where you're maybe reading something and then something shifts, or the person is straight, for instance, or I related to that person, but now it's different, or it's a really clumsy question. I realise.
Um, I don't think there's ever been a time where there's been a character that I've been like, oh, this is wrong that you're straight. But there's
Mm.
definitely times I've been like, this doesn't feel entirely natural. And it's sort of like an expectation that it's gonna be part of the story, and it's just not. But I do think that like as a teenager reading a lot of like young adult fiction at a time where queer representation was certainly improving, I would always just shift to the LGBT character. So I don't know. Maybe if I was sort of around 10 years earlier, maybe that's something that would have been much more common for me. But yeah,
Well, I'm glad to hear that your experience of reading and just seeing representation. I know we talked earlier about representation, whether it be in and around football or obviously representation in fiction and in media.
yeah,
You talked, that visibility to actually, yes, you can identify with everyone, can't we? To different traits, different experiences that they might have, but actually something as core and as fundamental in terms of someone's sexuality, to actually see that explicitly there
yeah.
is changing, hopefully.
I think it definitely is. And I mean, I'm 25 years old. I started school when Section 28 was still in force. I finished school when same sex marriage was legal. So, like, even in just the time that I was at school, an insane rate of change and progress was being made. And now that those advancements have been achieved, this is why we can focus on things like media representation. And I do think those things are improving all the time. Um, and I think if I'd been around 10 years earlier, I think I would have had a bit more trouble with it. And if I'd been around 10 years later, I probably would have had less trouble with it. But I suppose that's the nature of it. It's easy. It would be easy to get jealous of the progress that's come after my time, but I'd rather focus on the fact that it it keeps getting better.
And people who are able to have conversations, who are able to be open to this, who are able to be active allies or intentional allies, as we mentioned earlier, will continue to help that. So I genuinely want to encourage anyone who's listening to consider where do you sit on that spectrum and what can you do to show that intent.
Yeah.
I suppose my question, Jack, is you have been absolutely incredible in terms of talking to me today, of answering questions, of that willingness to share and to share not just with me, but obviously to anyone that's listening. And I just want to ask if there's anything else that you would want to comment on, or any sort of final points that you'd want to make.
Um, I guess it would just be going back to the point of, like, when people say about shoving it in your face and with the Rainbow Laces campaign and with rainbows everywhere, all we're trying to do is make things easier. And it's not like some different alien system that makes things worse for LGBT people. Like, it's the same social pressures that inspire homophobia that also enforce those rigid expectations of masculinity on men that cause those problems with not being able to express emotions. Like, it's all one system. And I think if there's one thing that sort of people take away, we're all kind of fighting against the same thing, really. Like, all this progress is not different kinds of beasts. It's all against changing the pressures that we're all under, even if those pressures aren't the same. The system that enforces it is. And I think that's an important thing for people to remember, especially when they're thinking, oh, God, more gay stuff. It's like, we're fighting the same fight here.
And I think that phrase is probably a perfect way to wrap up. Genuinely want to say thank you, Jack, for
Oh,
coming
thank
on,
you for having
for
me.
talking as openly as you have done. It's genuinely inspiring, and thank you for putting up with some of my clumsy questioning at times. That's always appreciated. And what I want to say to everyone listening is, please go and check out organisations like Rainbow Blades, or whoever, any of the affiliated or even non-affiliated organisations who are trying to make other people's lives better. I'll put some links in the show notes as well, to Twitter handles and to different websites where you can get in touch, you can sign up and hear news and how things are changing, evolving, initiatives you can get involved in. And again, just a final huge thank you to Jack. for volunteering his time to speak to me on what is currently a relatively rainy Wednesday evening. On that note, I want to say a huge thank you again. Please share, like, comment on this, please. The more we can spread the word, the more we can talk about male mental health more generally, the experiences that we all can have, the more we can make positive change. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you. Night.